going on between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And there was an Iranian airplane going, and civilian airplane going to Yemen, and the Yemeni delegation were on board. So when they got to Yemen, they wanted to land on the, in the international airport in Sana'a. So they were challenged by the Saudi Air Force and their fighter jet that tried to force them out of the airspace. Then the airplane went to the western part of Yemen, but Saudi hit the target, the runway of that international airport in Sana'a. But after all, we had the Iranian airport there landing in the western part in the Al Hodeidah, if I'm not mistaken, airport. Then Yemen said we're going to respond. As we talk, they have responded. They hit two targets, at least two locations in Saudi Arabia. They attacked with ballistic missiles and drones. They hit the Abha International Airport together with King Khalid Air Base. They hit the two targets, and later on they just issued an announcement here. This announcement said, in this context, we warn all airlines against flying through Saudi Arabia airspace and urge them to take our warning seriously until the blockade on Sana'a International Airport is lifted. Basically, they're putting blockade on Saudi Arabia until Saudi Arabia decides to lift the siege on Yemen. This is the complexity of the issue. What is your understanding of these sort of attacks that have happened? What does Saudi Arabia want from this?
That's a good question because, the Saudis have been all over the place in the Iranian conflict. The way back, they thought they were going to easily take out the Houthis. MBS did a big sort of parade, if you will, the build up to that conflict, and then sort of walked back with his head between his legs. Similarly with the Iranian conflict, my understanding is that the Saudis behind the scenes were urging Trump on, thinking that this would remove the Iranians as a counterbalance to the Saudis. I mean, this goes way, way back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the CIA and the MI6 and others in the West using the Saudis and spreading Wahhabi sort of a version of Sunni Islam, radicalizing it, politicizing it in places like Pakistan and elsewhere, and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, as a attempt to counterbalance the growing Iranian influence by reigniting the Shia-Sunni split. And that backfired a bunch of ways. It backfired in Pakistan, it backfired in Afghanistan, it backfired in the unleashing and the sort of ground seeding, if you will, for future movements like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and the like. Pretty much universally part of the more radicalized sects of Sunni Islam, not Shia Islam, but a lot of it being done in order to counterbalance the Iranian regime, which is principally not driven by Shia Islam as much as it was, from the Western perspective, a criticism of U.S. Western Israeli influence in the Middle East, and in particular in Iran, but also as to Shia populations and the Palestinians throughout the Middle East. So now you have the Houthis are their own version of Shia Islam, but Iran saw as an opportunity to create an alignment in support of sort of the underdogs of the Middle East, support of Shia aligned sects, and they've been they're very resistant. I mean, Yemen goes back as a long, long history, and you've got a group of people in Yemen that are the kind of resistance forces that just don't go gently into that good night. The efforts of the Saudis to quash them and crush them failed, even though we unleashed a version of Al-Qaeda down there in Yemen. We helped destroy their economy and functioning society, but we did not defeat the Houthis. Then Trump, notoriously, in the beginning of 2025, went in to try to make sure, to guarantee that that particular strait would be open, and said he was going to whip the Houthis in 30 days. Ultimately, the conversations on Signal between staff members leaked. It showed that Vice President Vance was skeptical all the way back then of Middle Eastern interventions. Said didn't think this was going to work, but Hegseth was gung-ho, much like the Iran war. Of course, Trump couldn't win. This was Larry Johnson's point. How are we going to keep the Strait of Hormuz open when we couldn't defeat the Houthis, who are much smaller version of Iran? And so ultimately we just sort of left and pretended we won. But the Red Sea, I mean, that has never been reopened the way it was before the Houthis put restrictions and restraints on it. Then you get the buildup to the Iran war, and the Houthis have said they'll be willing and ready to step up when called upon or when time necessitates it. The beginning of the war, MBS was with MBZ of UAE and the Emiratis, with, to a degree, but lesser, the Qataris. The Bahrainians will do pretty much whatever the Saudis want for the most part, because you got a Sunni royal family governing a predominantly Shia population in Bahrain, and with a large U.S. military presence. Kuwait will do whatever the U.S. asks them to do. I mean, they're as docile can be. They've not only were their borders and power created by the British Empire before the U.S. Empire, but that's just who and what they are and have been for quite some time. But as the war progressed, the MBS and the Saudis got second thoughts. Putin and the Russians strongly discouraged them from getting further involved and engaged in the conflict, and to reject now deceased Senator Lindsey Graham's proposal to join formally and fully the war against Iran.
I think you can say the late Senator Lindsey Graham.
Yes, the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Yes, indeed. Let's just say not all of us are mourning it. We'll put it that way. There's people whose deaths you mourn, and there's people whose death you don't mourn. And Lindsey Graham is in the latter category, given the amount of death he visited upon the world while he was a public official in the Senate of the United States of America, and before that, the House of Representatives of the United States of America. But so about midway through, in mid to late March, the Saudis changed their tune, decided that this conflict was putting too much at risk, that the U.S. could not win it the way the U.S. thought they could, the way the Saudis thought they could, and began to retract and recede from further engagement. In fact, began a parallel track with the Pakistanis, the Turks, and the Iranians, in creating sort of a NATO, Islamic NATO, that would counterbalance the pressure of both the United States and Israel in the region. But, MBS goes back and forth on delivering on that. The Qataris go back and forth on delivering on that. The Emiratis go back and forth on delivering on that. And we see it there's no real reason to escalate against the Houthis at this point if you're the Saudis. But it appears the Saudis were allowing their air bases to be used to attack Iran, which they had said they weren't going to do. The same with the Qataris. Now it seems, apparently, what's fascinating is the most gung-ho group throughout the whole Gulf country coalition. The GCC was the Emiratis initially, but it appears now the Emiratis are the most backing off, maybe because they recognize that Dubai is going to be gone bye-bye if they don't find some resolution with Iran. So it was a bit surprising to me that the Saudis started hitting the Houthis and, inviting the Houthis to escalate, which they were likely to do anyway, because the Iranian escalatory ladder has been mostly restrained, far more restrained than is understood or appreciated in the West. Because closing down that other strait, it's not just like people are like, oh, it's 4 or 5%. It's actually more, because that's how people were getting around the Strait of Hormuz, in particular, the Saudis. And the Saudis can send it through some other directions, but it'll be much more costly, expensive, and time-consuming. And so the question becomes how long you can leave both straits closed, given the amount of oil, natural gas, fertilizer, helium for semiconductor chips, which go into AI, computer base, which is a huge share of the growth of the U.S. economy under President Trump. So that this risk just keeps escalating. And, people like Professor Pape's escalation trap looks more apt than the exit that has been repeatedly afforded by various deals that Vice President Vance has obtained with Iran. And Trump just keeps showing he's deal incapable. So, but I am surprised that it's really dependent now on the Gulf Coast countries, if they don't want to be hit or at risk of major hit, for them to escalate the path of creating a new security arrangement in the Middle East that excludes the United States and restrains Israel. But as long as they're still too busy worried about their internal opponents, whether it's the Shia militias in Iraq, whether it's the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, or the Iranians, rather than the broader security threat that U.S. presence poses in a mentally unreliable president in the White House currently presents, then they're at risk of letting this thing get way out of control in ways they can't contain.
One of the main issues, Robert, is the case of the oil and energy, and we know how is the situation with the case of Saudi Arabia. If they want to fight back against Yemenis, they don't have the access to the Persian Gulf right now. So they have the pipeline going to the Red Sea. If the people in Ansarullah in Yemen decides to attack their pipeline or decide their oil facilities, that's going to be so easy for them to hit the targets there, because it's impossible for Saudi Arabia to control the pipeline, to defend the pipeline. It's almost impossible. And I don't know why do they what is the mindset on their part when they decide to attack Yemen this way. This is just
it's they got Trump disease. Because especially you're also really helping the Iranians get off the hook, because it allows Iran to let the Houthis hit the oil infrastructure and close the additional strait rather than they try to do so. And they've avoided hitting back on the Saudis during this latest round of tit-for-tat attacks, and for the most part. And this would allow a green light to let the Houthis do their business for them. And the Houthis have been eager to sort of step in and prove their merit in this context and in this conflict. So I agree with you. I find it baffling. I mean, initially when I heard it, I thought maybe it's Israel pretending to be the Saudis, but no, clearly it was the Saudis. And so this is just counterproductive. But you're seeing an incapacity for people in large parts of the U.S.-Israel aligned world to think in clear, rational terms, much like you see in the U.S. Western Europe world as to Russia, that you're seeing logic that anybody that's just an independent analyst that doesn't have a bone in the fight, a dog in the fight, is like, this is not rational. This is unlikely to produce the outcome you want, and it reduces your chance of reward and increases your chance of risk. And I think, and maybe the Saudis thought this is a good time to show the Houthis because Iran's distracted with the U.S.-Israeli attack, but that was poor logic if that's what they're going. I mean, I think the other thing to remember, so many of these Gulf states are, royal oligarchs that don't have democratic legitimacy and authority from their populations, that often are going against what their populations want as to both the U.S. and Israel. Bin Laden originated, his first big complaint was the presence of the U.S. military near Mecca and Medina. It wasn't, anything else as one of his primary complaints against the United States, as he turned from working with the U.S. in Afghanistan to against them a half decade later. So this has been a source of controversy for quite some time within the Saudi world and in much of the royals world in general. And then the whole Arab world and Muslim world has sat by and watched as these countries did pretty much nothing to stop Israel from razing Gaza to the ground. And then they refused to remove U.S. military bases from their region, even though those military bases are an invitation to attack. And they act with moral indignation at getting hit after they used their military. U.S. used their territory to launch attacks against Iran. I mean, I saw some of these UAE princess types. They're like, oh, how dare they do this? I think it's a reminder. I mean, has the Saudis ever won a war? Really? I mean, so, you look at this is not their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents' generation of geopolitical restraint, of people who grew up the hard way, of people who established their power the hard way. These are pampered, privileged kids who grew up playing Call of Duty like MBS and MBZ, grew up heavily influenced by Western culture, who are disconnected from large parts of their own history, whose borders were and empowerment derived from the British Empire in the West, principally, and in that way they couldn't be more different than Hezbollah, more different than the Palestinian resistance, more distant than the Houthis, more distant than the Persians in Iran, defending an ancient civilization, one of the most ancient in the world. So I think what you're seeing is examples of people whose political skill set is really quite limited. You're seeing a bunch of privileged, pampered kids with a King Lear in the American White House, showing how dangerous that combination can be to the world. We haven't seen anything like that really since World War I, when everybody lost their minds, and it produced There is no Hitler without World War One. There is no fascism without World War One. There is no communism without World War One. World War One sunk the world for the better part of a century. And you're seeing the same degree of idiocy and incompetency and entitlement and arrogance and hubris in the West that we saw back then.
Yeah. Robert, Donald Trump announced that the U.S. blockade of Iran will go into effect tomorrow at 8 p.m. And then here is the question is that what has changed so far? He decided to lift the blockade, sign a document called so-called MOU, and right now he's putting back the blockade, and he's talking about even, he's talking about charging 20% of, the new toll system that he's going to put in place in the Strait of Hormuz. You had the Iranian, foreign minister responding to Donald Trump. What does he want with this blockade? Again, putting it back.
It's simple. Toddler Trump mad. Toddler Trump want bomb. Toddler Trump want blockade. Toddler Trump get what Toddler Trump want. That's quite literally the logic. There is no other logic. Every objective geopolitical observer in the United States has pointed out from the get-go, what are you going to achieve here? Even people who are harsh critics of Iran, people who are strong supporters, President Trump even, are like, there's no winning obtaining here. You cannot, through blockading them, get a improvement on traffic out of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. You can't, through bombing them, get an improvement in the traffic coming out of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. And we need it coming out, as Trump himself acknowledged just a couple of weeks ago, about 4 weeks ago, in fact. He said we got 4 weeks before we can't even use all of our reserves to be able to substitute for all that's missing coming out of the Gulf. And that doesn't even talk about the helium, which China just added to that burden by saying we're not going to be exporting any more helium. They're one of the world's largest producers of helium. So you got about half of the helium taken out of the global marketplace. And helium is not something you can store. You need it constant and continuous. And what does helium go into? Semiconductor chips. What is semiconductor chips necessary for? All the data center compute built out in the United States. What is that going to? That's going to almost all of the increase in the stock market of the United States. Almost all of the GDP growth in Trump's presidency in his second term has derived from AI and data compute buildouts. So he's putting everything at jeopardy, putting the stock market boom that he's taking credit for in jeopardy. And why does that matter? Shouldn't usually matter so much, since the stock market's only owned by the top 10% for the most part. However, the top 10% now account in our K-shaped U.S. economy for over half of consumer spending. So it means if they get nervous, if they pull back, not only do you get an equity market implosion, which could then impact 401ks and IRAs and retirement benefits for U.S. workers, but it could also lead to a substantial shrinking of domestic consumer spending, which then has a bunch of follow-up implications and ramifications for the U.S. economy, separate from and independent of the fertilizer problem, creating a food shortage problem, creating a massive food price impact. Sure, independent of the fuel price impact, because the crack spreads keep growing. I would kind of ignore almost the future prices because there's been so much manipulation in those futures markets, and the timing of it, and that some of this appears to be regular and predictable in such a way that's a government actor in all likelihood. But what you can't print gas, can't print diesel. America's a net importer of heavy crude oil, which comes from the Gulf in particular. And so we are very susceptible to a lack of that, as the president acknowledged a month ago. So what you'll look for is, don't follow the futures price, follow the U.S. domestic gas price, the price at the pump, the price of diesel, the price of jet fuel. And diesel is essential because it not only is the number one key energy source for U.S. farming and agriculture, but it is also essential to our entire distribution network in the United States for truckers and the like. So, as diesel prices go up, then every other price goes up for the most part in the U.S. economy due to its essential role in transporting shipped goods. So what does that mean? It means for the ordinary person, you get real inflation. Like when they put the sanctions on Russia, a lot of the inflation was limited to the elite because it was, Gucci bags they couldn't afford anymore or doubled in price. But because they were a self-sufficient supplier of fuel and a self-sufficient supplier of food, that were increasingly produced all of their sort of low-end consumer products or getting them from China without sanctions. The ordinary Russian didn't feel it. Here, what's the worst about this inflation is it falls the hardest, the heaviest on the ordinary American in things they expense every single day. Every time they go to the pump and fill up, every time they go to the grocery store, every time they go to the wholesale store, every time they look at their utility bill. And they're going to blame Trump specifically for this. They're going to blame his war policies in particular for it. And it's precisely what Trump ran against. He said, I'll get down your food bill. I'll get down your fuel bill. I'll get it way down. I'll get it down under $3 at the pump. I'll get down your utilities bills. I guarantee it. I'll deliver it. And by the way, I won't do dumb wars in the Middle East. And by doing a dumb war in the Middle East, he's betrayed a very core promise. And we're on the clock. We're a few months away from the midterms. And at this rate, Trump will get devastated in the House. Democrats will win huge. He'll get devastated in the Senate. Democrats will win big. And then what does that mean? It means investigations. It means impeachments. It means potential removal from the presidency and a complete collapse of any agenda that he could get done in the final 2 years of his second term. So that's what's at stake. And yet he's gambling with it like he confabulates and deludes himself into thinking that something can work that has just been proven not to work now for month after month after month after month after month. Iran will not capitulate to coercive messaging. Bombing will not change Iran's position. The blockading of the strait will not change Iran's position. He's running around pretending, oh, the strait is open. The strait is open. Everybody can see it from all the independent sites that track the traffic. No, it's not. It's closed. But he wants to pretend it's open and pretend it's all going to be flowing through and pretend that Iran's going to send him a capitulation notice tomorrow. He just deludes himself into thinking things that no rational person could believe. And if anybody still doubts whether Trump is acting with 3D chess or some sort of 4D chess or intelligence strategy, this should finally kind of put an end to that. Trump is King Lear in the White House, deluding and denuding himself into inane and insane nonsense that is jeopardizing the entire world's global economy while damaging the security of the Middle East and the world by engaging in this constant, continuous conflict with Iran.